but not the way you think. There were no screams, no shattered glasses, no thrown bouquets. Instead, the bride vanished like a breath leaving a mirror, and returned wearing a calm so devastating, it made even the chandeliers tremble. Because sometimes revenge arrives dressed as truth, and truth is louder than any outburst. The morning of the wedding did not begin with joy. It began with symmetry. Everything in that estate had been arranged to perfection. Hydrangea arches bent in identical curves, ivory ribbons tied with the discipline of soldiers, and rows of chairs so precisely aligned they looked like they had been measured with a ruler rather than imagination. Even the sky had cooperated. It wore a soft pearl-gray hush that made the world feel pause button still. The bride, Liana, stood at her window wrapped in a white silk robe that whispered instead of moved. She stared out at the gardens where staff hurried like silent bees, placing last-minute candles, polishing glasses that were already polished, stirring life into a place that pretended it didn't need help from anyone. The estate belonged to her family, though she rarely said that aloud. Generations of land and manors stood beneath her feet, but she wore it lightly, as though privilege were a pair of shoes she didn't want leaving marks on the carpet. Her mother used to say that Liana had an old soul, the kind that doesn't announce itself but reveals itself slowly, like a melody you don't realize you've been humming. She moved with softness, but it was the sturdy softness of river water, not the fragile softness of lace. People mistook that for gentleness, and gentleness for weakness. They often learned too late how wrong they were. Her gown hung on the wardrobe door behind her, a cloud waiting to be stepped into. The seamstress had called it a hymn. Her father called it the last gift he would ever give his daughter with no conditions attached. Liana had simply touched the fabric and thought it didn't feel like her yet. Dresses only become real when a woman breathes into them. Up until that moment, they are promises waiting to be fulfilled. She lifted her hand and traced a fingertip along the window's edge, feeling the brief coldness. It grounded her. This day was supposed to be the beginning of the life she had been constructing in her mind for years. A life with Jonathan, a man whose confidence filled rooms, whose smile talked people into believing he meant every word. He had charmed her with quiet seriousness, with sudden laughter, with the kind of attention that makes a woman feel seen even when she's spent a lifetime being visible to everyone but understood by few. But weddings, she had learned, were not built on romance alone. They were built on narrative. What families needed to show, what friends needed to witness, what communities needed to celebrate. And beneath all of that stood the two people at its center, holding up the weight of everyone else's expectations. She thought she had prepared herself for those expectations. Yet that morning, something felt off. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was the strange stillness that arrives before a storm. She tried to name it, but names often betray us when we reach for them too quickly. So she simply breathed and let the feeling sit quietly in her chest. A guest that had arrived early and without invitation. Downstairs, the scent of warm pastries and brewed coffee drifted through the halls. People were arriving, uncles with proud shoulders, cousins carrying laughter like lanterns, old family friends whose eyes softened when they saw her. They moved through the estate in elegant waves, admiring the paintings, greeting relatives, whispering predictions about the ceremony. Liana loved them, yet today every face felt distant, as though she were looking at them through a veil thicker than the one she would soon place over her own head. Her bridesmaids entered her suite in bursts of perfume and feathers of excitement. Among them was Harper, her maid of honor, the woman who had known her since childhood, who shared secrets carved in the kind of memory only little girls can keep. They had once promised they would stand at each other's weddings, promised they'd raise children who knew each other like cousins, promised they'd grow old sharing stories over kitchen tables. Harper smiled at her with a familiarity that belonged to years, but behind that smile flickered something Liana couldn't place. It moved too quickly, like a bird's shadow passing over water. The makeup artist arrived soon after, followed by the hairstylist, followed by the photographer whose job was to freeze moments that didn't want to stay still. They flurried around her with brushes and pins and words of reassurance, painting beauty onto a canvas that already held its own glow. Liana let them work, her mind drifting. She felt as though she were floating above herself, watching a bride being constructed the way florists construct bouquets. Carefully, delicately, with the hope that everything will hold. A bridesmaid tuned the playlist for the morning preparations. Soft strings filled the room, each note stretching across the silence inside her. Liana closed her eyes briefly. The music should have soothed her, but instead it reminded her of all the music she had once imagined her marriage would hold. Laughter in the kitchen, footsteps in shared hallways, whispered confessions handed over like small gifts. She had built dreams with Jonathan the way children build treehouses, piece by piece, with trust as the ladder. But trust is a thing that breathes quietly until it suddenly doesn't. When the gown was finally slipped over her shoulders, Liana thought she would feel the transformation that brides always talk about, the moment the fabric embraces you and says, "This is your beginning." But instead, she felt something else, distance. As though the dress belonged to a future she wasn't entirely sure she had earned. She tried to brush off the feeling, smoothing the silk, adjusting the bodice, lifting the veil. The mirror reflected her in soft light, a woman who looked ethereal and composed. Yet her eyes betrayed a tension she could not quite decipher, a tension that whispered, "Pay attention." Her father entered slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter if he moved too quickly. His eyes watered before he even spoke. He placed his hands on her shoulders the way he used to steady her bicycle when she was 6. She leaned into that memory for a heartbeat, letting its warmth soften her chest. He told her she looked timeless. She wished she felt that way. With every passing minute, the estate became louder. Guests settling into seats, musicians warming up, someone calling for the officiant, laughter bubbling from the courtyard. The world outside her door buzzed with momentum, but inside, time felt thick, syrup-like, refusing to move. The coordinator stepped in to announce it was almost time. Her heart fluttered and then steadied. Almost time meant everything she had imagined would soon become reality. It meant stepping into a story that had been written by more than just her own hands. She exhaled slowly, letting the air leave her like a held note. Her father offered his arm, and she took it. Together they moved toward the hallway, where the sound of string instruments danced like anticipation. As she walked, she caught fragments of conversation, little pieces of lives moving around her. Someone remarking on the weather, another praising the floral arrangements, someone else whispering about the cost of the venue. These were the details of weddings, the small talk that covers the electric truth beneath, that a marriage is a leap into the unknown, and everyone present is a witness to the moment before the fall. Near the end of the corridor, Harper was waiting, bouquet in hand, smile too practiced. She adjusted Liana's veil with gentle fingertips. But again, that flicker, that shadow of something unresolved, passed through her expression. Liana filed it away in her mind, not knowing yet why her instincts had sharpened. They reached the final door before the garden aisle, the door brides pass through when they are seconds away from a new life. Liana's breath steadied, her fingers tightened on her bouquet. Outside, the music swelled, the cue for the ceremony to begin. Then the coordinator rushed off to gather the last details. Harper stepped away to check something on her phone, and Liana, adjusting her veil one last time, found herself standing alone in the hush before the moment. That was when she heard it. Not a sound meant for her ears, not a voice meant to reach her heart, but words, low, urgent, unmistakable, floating through the slightly ajar door at the end of the hall. A man's voice, familiar and intimate, Jonathan's, and a woman's whisper woven into it like thread through cloth. Liana froze, breath suspended, instinct sharpening into a blade. She wasn't meant to hear it, but she did, and the world she thought she was walking into began to shift beneath her feet. The first thing that struck her was not the words themselves, but the tone. The way Jonathan's voice fell into the air beyond the door was different from the way he spoke when people were listening. There was no polished charm, no careful warmth, none of the curated patience he had worn like a suit since the day they met. This voice was sharper, clipped at the edges, as if it had nothing left to prove and no one to impress. Liana stood still, her fingers tightening around the bouquet until the stems pressed grooves into her palm. The music outside dulled into a distant hum, as though someone had turned down the volume of the world. Only that voice remained. "We're almost there," Jonathan said, words low but clear. "After today, it's done. Her family stops asking questions, my position is solid, and we can all breathe." Her mind grabbed onto different parts of that sentence like hands reaching for a ledge. Almost there. After today. Her family. Position. She blinked, and the hallway seemed to tilt by a fraction. She might have convinced herself she was hearing out of context, a fragment of a conversation about business or logistics. But then another voice rose to join his, and the air in her lungs turned thick. Harper. That familiar softness, that half-whisper she'd heard over teenage secrets and late-night confessions, now filtered through wood and distance in a tone she didn't recognize. It carried a strain of impatience, a thread of something that sounded a lot like jealousy dressed up as concern. "You always say that," Harper murmured, the words blurred but still graspable. "You keep promising this is the last hoop you have to jump through, that once the ring is on her finger and the ink is dry, we'll be able to stop pretending. You realize I've been pretending longer than you have." Liana's heart, obedient for so long, misstepped. Pretending. The bouquet in her hand felt suddenly wrong, like a prop on the wrong stage. She found herself leaning closer to the door, the veil brushing lightly against the carved panel, as if the fabric itself wanted to listen. The edge of the door was open just enough for voices to escape, not enough to grant her the right to see. Jonathan exhaled with a short, humorless laugh. "You talk like you're the one marrying into an old family with more money than patience." I'm the one being inspected like a product. Her father has lawyers hidden behind every smile. Her mother thinks this wedding is a transaction with God. I'm just making sure the deal sticks. The deal. Her mind snagged on that word like a dress hem on a nail. She felt connected to his sentence not as a person, but as a component. A variable. Not someone being chosen, but something being acquired. Harper made a sound that might have been a scoff, might have been a suppressed sob. Don't pretend you're some helpless victim of their bank accounts. You chose this. You chose her. You told me this was the smart move. The way to secure everything fast enough that we wouldn't have to waste years climbing ladders other people built. You were the one who said marrying her puts you at the table for good. Outside, a bird chirped once against the distant music, as if protesting the way the word marrying had just been used. Liana's fingers trembled, the bouquet shifting in her grasp. For a moment, she was no longer a bride about to walk down an aisle. She was back in their small apartment 3 years ago, barefoot in the kitchen, laughing when Jonathan burned the pancakes and swore he would never try to impress her with cooking again. She had believed, then, that moments like those were the foundation of everything. Shared clumsiness, mutual trying. But foundations look different when the light changes. Sometimes they reveal cracks you never saw because you were too busy admiring the walls. Harper's voice came again, quieter, edged with something brittle. And what about what you promised me? Because I'm not just a prop in this circus. I'm the one who handled your nerves, who edited your story, who made her trust you faster than she normally would. I am the reason this wedding is happening at all. Don't make me feel like some consolation prize on the side while you play devoted husband in public. Liana flinched as if slapped, though no hand had touched her. The words slid under her skin, rewiring memories. Suddenly, all the moments Harper had encouraged her to give Jonathan another chance when he was distant, all the times she had framed his silence as stress, his forgetfulness as distraction, rearranged themselves into something else. The puzzle pieces on the table of her mind shifted, snapping into a picture she wasn't ready to see. Jonathan's answer was lower, rougher. You're not a consolation prize and you know that. How many times have I told you that once the dust settles, we'll figure out what we look like without all of this scrutiny? Right now, I need her. I need the access, the respect, the credibility that comes with being in that family. It opens doors that would take me 10 lifetimes to kick down alone. This is the way through. You said so yourself when this started. Liana almost laughed, though there was nothing funny in the hallway. She imagined, distantly, her father describing Jonathan as a self-made man, her mother praising his determination, guests murmuring that he was a good match for her, a hard worker with a promising future. If they had known that in another room he was confessing he needed her family like a Kieran, would they have spoken differently? Would they have noticed the hunger in him was not just ambition but calculation? Harper's reply came after a beat of silence thick enough to feel. I said so when it felt like we were in it together. When it felt like you and I were a secret waiting for the right time. Not a mistake you plan to manage until your next promotion. You still haven't given me a real answer, Jonathan. What happens to me after today? Do I just keep smiling in her pictures? Keep pretending I don't know what your hands feel like? Keep listening to her talk about growing old with you while I'm stuck growing old with regret in the background? The words your hands felt like washed through Liana's ears like ice water. Details bloomed uninvited. The way Harper had sometimes brushed lint off Jonathan's jacket with more intimacy than necessary. The way he had once laughed too quickly at one of her jokes. The way their eyes occasionally met in a quick, unreadable flash across dinner tables. Liana had archived those details under the label "They're close because they both care about me." Now, in the corridor with her heart hammering against silk and bone, that label peeled away. Jonathan's voice, when it came, carried an impatience that made something inside Liana go still. You keep asking questions like I control the universe. I don't. I'm just trying to survive it. You know how this works. Once I'm in, I can start steering things. Right now, we're guests in their kingdom. So yes, you smile, and yes, we keep quiet, and yes, it's messy and unfair and uncomfortable, but it's temporary. The money, the connections, the leverage, it all lands after today. And then we can breathe. You knew what we were signing up for. We, the plural landed heavier than any vow he'd ever spoken to her. Somewhere, faintly, she heard a guest laugh in the distance, oblivious to the tectonic shift happening on the other side of a thin strip of wood. Her father was probably straightening his tie, her mother checking the seating arrangements one last time. The officiant might be reviewing his notes, preparing to ask if anyone had any objection to this union. If she walked through that door right now, what would they see on her face? Would they recognize the instant when a daughter, a bride, a woman, realized she was less a partner and more a passageway? Harper's voice lowered into a plea. Just tell me you still choose me, even if it's later, or in the dark, or in the spaces between what everyone else sees. I can live with the waiting if I know I'm not waiting alone. Choose me. The phrase echoed down corridors of memory, colliding with another scene. Liana was 18, sitting under the old oak tree in her parents' garden, telling Harper about her first crush. She had said, half laughing, that all she wanted someday was to be chosen without conditions. Someone who wasn't there for the parties or the last name or the way money made things easier, but for the quiet version of her, the girl in worn sweatpants who laughed too hard at bad jokes and cried at commercials. Harper had nodded so earnestly, promised that anyone who didn't choose her for that was a fool. Now the same mouth spoke about being chosen on the side. Jonathan's answer arrived, each word another weight placed on Liana's chest. Of course I choose you. Haven't I proved that? I've risked all of this just to keep you close. But right now, the priority is making sure this marriage happens. No cold feet, no doubts, no scenes. We need her to walk down that aisle, say yes, sign the papers, and trust me. If she falls apart, everything falls apart with her, and then we're back to nothing. You don't want to go back, do you? Trust me. She almost stepped back from the door, as if the phrase had snapped like a live wire. He had said those two words to her more times than she could count. When she asked about his past relationships, when she wondered why he never spoke much about his family, when he grew distant during the months his career seemed on the edge of something big but unnamed. Trust me, he'd said, pressing his forehead to hers. Trust me, when her parents raised cautious questions. Trust me, when she hesitated at the idea of combining finances, of merging lives as seamlessly as everyone insisted they should. Outside, the music changed. The processional song for the bridesmaids floated through the air like a soundtrack to a life that no longer matched the script. Somewhere, bridesmaids began their careful walk down the aisle, unaware that the bride stood in a hallway discovering she was the final puzzle piece in someone else's strategy. Harper sighed on the other side of the door, soft and resigned. I don't want to go back. I just don't want to disappear. Promise me I don't disappear after today. There was a rustle, a shift, the faint sound of fabric moving against fabric, the adjusted weight of bodies standing too close. Silence for a beat, then Jonathan's murmur, low enough that Liana had to strain to catch it. You won't disappear. Not from me. Then, the unmistakable wet sound of a kiss. Not the chaste kind exchanged at family gatherings, but the lingering kind that belongs to people who have known each other's mouths long enough to communicate without words. It was brief, broken by the urgency of time, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what her mind had tried, for the last few minutes, to label as misunderstanding. Liana's vision narrowed. The hallway shrunk to a tunnel at the end of which that door stood like a judge. For a strange, weightless moment, she imagined walking in, veil lifted, bouquet tossed aside, watching their faces rearrange themselves in the shock of being seen. She imagined throwing accusations into the room like knives, imagined guests gathering around to witness the implosion, imagined the kind of chaos that makes headlines and cautionary tales. But that was not who she was. There was another version of her inside, older, quieter, who had learned from watching her mother navigate 1,000 small humiliations without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Dignity, her mother had told her once, wasn't about never being hurt. It was about refusing to let the wound become someone else's spectacle. The music swelled again. Someone called her name from the far end of the corridor. The coordinator's voice hurried, bright with performance. It's time, she heard, faintly. Time for what? The question drifted through her. Time to betray herself by going along with this? Time to detonate her own life in front of 100 witnesses? Time to choose, not between two people, but between two versions of herself. The one who went ahead because she was expected to, and the one who stepped away from the altar of a lie. Inside the room, Jonathan's voice grew brisk. All business again. You should go. If we're both missing, someone will notice. Remember, you're her anchor today. Keep her calm. No hint of nerves. The last thing we need is her intuition kicking in at the wrong moment. Her intuition. The irony lodged itself in her throat like a stone. Footsteps moved away from the door. A chair scraped lightly. The sound of a zipper, a laugh too forced, the clink of glass. Liana stepped back just before the handle turned. She moved as though pulled by an invisible string into a shallow alcove, the kind where generations of portraits watched generations of secrets pass by. Harper emerged first, bouquet in hand, cheeks flushed in a way that could be mistaken for excitement. Her eyes flicked up the hallway and widened for a heartbeat when she saw Liana standing there in full bridal white. There was a moment, the smallest crack of time, in which their gazes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Guilt, panic, calculation. Harper recovered quickly, her face stretching back into its well-practiced mask of loyalty. If Liana hadn't heard the conversation, she might have believed that expression. She might have leaned into her best friend's open arms and said she was nervous, that she needed her to walk beside her. Instead, she merely watched, taking in everything. The way Harper's hand tightened slightly on the bouquet, the way her gaze darted past Liana toward the end of the hall where the ceremony waited, the way she didn't ask the obvious question, "Are you okay?" Because that question would invite answers nobody was ready to hear. Jonathan stepped out a moment later, adjusting his cufflinks, his tie, the facade. He looked every inch the groom people expected, handsome in his tailored suit, hair perfectly in place, smile warmed up and ready. When he glanced up and saw her, his eyes lit with rehearsed delight. It was a performance he had perfected, the adoring fiancé, the man humbled by the love of a woman like her. If she hadn't just listened through a door, she might have melted at that smile the way she always had. He walked toward her with that easy confidence, that careful stride that suggested control. As he drew near, she noticed what she had never paid attention to before, small things, trivial on any other day. The faint shadow of stubble he had missed shaving, a tiny wrinkle at the edge of his collar, the way his eyes flickered, just once, to Harper before settling on her. Details that, when put together, painted a story. He reached out, fingertips brushing her elbow, the contact light, proprietary. "You look," he began, but his words felt like a script she no longer believed. She did not pull away, not yet. She let the touch land and then fall, her expression composed. She heard herself saying something expected, a soft acknowledgement that could pass for affection. The sound of her own voice surprised her. It was steady, almost serene. Inside, a storm had begun to form over an ocean that had, until an hour ago, been calm. The coordinator reappeared, flustered but smiling. "Everyone's ready," she said. "Bridesmaids are lined up. The music's cued. We just need our beautiful bride." Beautiful bride. The words fluttered around Liana like confetti, pretty and weightless. She glanced down the corridor toward the double doors that led to the garden. Beyond them lay the aisle, the guests, the vows, the signature on papers that would bind her to a man who saw her family as a stepping stone and her body as a necessary prop in a performance he intended to turn into profit. Behind her, in the rooms they had just left, lingered the ghosts of stolen kisses and whispered promises she had never been invited to hear. For a moment, she considered confessing everything right there in the hallway, taking her father aside, telling him what she'd heard, watching the fury and protective grief bloom across his face. She imagined her mother's hand flying to her mouth, Harper's mask finally cracking, Jonathan's practiced composure shattering like glass dropped on marble. The scene unrolled in her mind with brutal clarity. But then another thought rose, clearer, stronger. What if she did not let them decide how this story would be told? What if, instead of reacting, she allowed this new knowledge to settle like sediment, to clarify the water of her understanding? What if she did what no one expected, walk into the ceremony not as a woman blindly in love, but as a woman carrying a secret she intended to use, not in anger, but in precision? The idea frightened her. It also steadied her. Her father appeared at the far end of the hall, his face open, proud. He had no idea that the future he had blessed was, at this very second, splitting apart at the seams. When he saw her, his eyes shone with tears, his hand reaching out. She thought of all the years he had worked to maintain the family's reputation, of the quiet dignity with which he'd handled gossip and envy, of the trust he'd placed in her judgment when she chose Jonathan. Liana lifted her chin just slightly, drawing a breath as if filling herself with something heavier than air. She turned away from the door that had betrayed her and walked toward her father, each step deliberate. Harper fell into place behind her, the faithful maid of honor that no one yet knew was anything but. Jonathan moved toward the side entrance that would lead him to the waiting officiant. The corridor, once a simple passage, had become a threshold between two lives, the one she had planned and the one she was now being forced to confront. As she reached her father, he took her arm gently, fingers squeezing with a mixture of pride and sadness. She realized, in that moment, that there was more than one way to walk down an aisle. Some brides walked in blind faith, others walked in denial, and then there were those like her, who walked in armed with the truth, even if they hadn't yet decided what to do with it. The doors to the garden stood ahead, tall and solemn. The music swelled to the opening chords of the song she had chosen months ago, back when love had felt uncomplicated. The coordinator gave the signal. Guests rose from their seats beyond the doors, turning as one toward the path she was about to take. The last thing Liana did before those doors opened was close her eyes for a heartbeat and listen inward. The chaos of her thoughts, the hurt, the disbelief, all spiraled, but beneath them she felt something else, a quiet, growing resolve. It did not yet have a name, but it had a direction, not toward spectacle, not toward martyrdom, but toward something like justice, shaped in a way that would not cost her the one thing she could still protect, herself. The doors swung open. Light broke over her like a wave, the aisle stretching before her, lined with petals and expectation. 100 faces turned toward her, their collective breath held in admiration and curiosity. Somewhere to the left, Harper's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Somewhere to the right, a distant cousin raised a phone to capture the moment. The string quartet played the melody as if nothing in the world were wrong. At the far end of the aisle, Jonathan stood waiting, hands clasped, face arranged into an expression of reverent anticipation. Those who loved her saw a man eager to receive her. She saw a man who had just discussed her life as an investment portfolio. Liana stepped forward, her father beside her, the dress gliding over the ground like a quiet tide. Each step was both a question and an answer. She did not know yet what she would do at the altar, what words would come out when it was time to say yes or no. All she knew was that she would not remain the woman who had walked into that corridor half an hour ago. That version of her had believed love was a shelter. This version understood it could also be a marketplace. The act of walking became its own kind of rising tension. With every footfall, every camera flash, every whispered compliment from the rows of guests, she felt farther away from the girl who had once planned this day with Harper over coffee and color swatches. She felt herself approaching, instead, a precipice where decisions were made not from naivety, but from clarity sharpened by betrayal. Somewhere between the third and fourth row, a child dropped a program and giggled. The sound, innocent and pure, cut through the thickness of the moment, reminding her that life contained more than this stage and its actors. Beyond this garden, somewhere, people were buying groceries, taking buses, arguing about trivial things. Her pain felt enormous, but it was also part of a bigger, messier world where hearts broke every day without music to accompany them. By the time she reached the halfway point, her chest had stopped heaving. The storm inside her had reorganized itself into something calmer, like clouds gathering purpose. Her grip on the bouquet loosened slightly, her shoulders relaxed. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that her eyes were no longer simply bright with bridal emotion. They were clear with something harder to define. It was there, in the middle of that aisle, that Liana made a promise. Not to Jonathan, not to the watching crowd, not even to her parents. She made it to herself. She would not let this betrayal turn her into someone she didn't recognize. She would not become cruel to match their cruelty, reckless to answer their manipulation. If she was going to respond, it would be in a way that honored the part of her that had always valued truth over drama. She would, she realized, allow the ceremony to unfold just long enough for everyone to feel safe. And then, when the moment was right, when their guard was down, she would return the favor of surprise. The rest of the walk became strangely easier. Her feet found their rhythm. Her veil caught the light just so. Guests smiled and sighed, some wiping away tears, believing they were watching the beginning of a fairy tale. In a way, they were, just not the one anyone expected. At the altar, her father placed her hand in Jonathan's. The contact was a jolt. His skin felt warm, familiar, and yet foreign all at once. He squeezed gently, the way a man does when he wants to communicate reassurance without words. She met his gaze and, for the first time, looked at him not as the man she loved but as the man she had just heard speak about her like a strategy. He saw something in her eyes then that he couldn't name. A flicker of distance, perhaps. A calm that didn't match the script. A tiny seed of doubt sprouted beneath his polished composure. He smiled a little wider, leaning into the role. The officiant began to speak, words about love and commitment and eternity floating into the air like doves released into a sky she now knew could hold storms at any minute. Liana listened, but also didn't. Her mind was simultaneously in that moment and back in the corridor, replaying every syllable, every inflection, every admission that had slipped from Jonathan's mouth when he thought she wasn't listening. Guests sat, stood, responded on cue. The ceremony unfolded with the grace of an event meticulously planned. Nothing on the surface betrayed the fault line running beneath their feet. But fault lines, by their nature, do not stay silent forever. She had become the keeper of a truth that would, sooner or later, demand to be spoken. When, how, and in front of whom, that, she knew, would be her decision. And that decision, when it came, would not just silence 100 guests. It would expose the man at the altar and the woman standing behind her, and it would show everyone in that garden exactly what a bride can do when she walks into a ceremony with her eyes wide open. The words of the officiant rolled over the garden like a practice tide, smooth and deliberate, washing over faces that had learned how to look moved on command. He spoke of love as a shelter, of commitment as a promise carved in time, of two families becoming one. Guests nodded solemnly, their hands folded, their hearts warmed by the familiarity of it all. Weddings, after all, are as much about the comfort of tradition as they are about the uniqueness of a couple. Liana stood at the center of it all, her hands still resting in Jonathan's, her bouquet anchored at her waist, her veil a soft curtain between her and the world. The scene would have looked beautiful to anyone watching, the bride radiant, the groom attentive, the aisle a river of petals leading back to rows of faces glowing with approval. A photographer circled quietly like a patient planet, capturing angles, freezing moments, immortalizing a story that, as far as everyone else knew, was exactly what it appeared to be. But inside her, nothing was still. The corridor conversation replayed itself on a loop, each line another crack widening in the foundation beneath her feet. Jonathan's words about deals and leverage. Harper's plea not to disappear. The heat of a kiss she had not seen but could hear. The casual way her life had been discussed like an acquisition, a means to a much more glittering end than love. She heard the officiant invite them to consider what brought them together. He spoke of fate, of timing, of that inexplicable pull that draws two people across a crowded room. People smiled, some thinking of their own loves, some thinking wistfully of loves they had lost. Liana, hearing the word fate, almost laughed. Had it been fate that brought Jonathan to her family's charity gala 3 years ago? Or had it been research, introductions arranged through acquaintances who understood exactly how valuable a link to her father could be? She remembered that night now in a different light. She had been standing near the drinks table, feeling overdressed and underinterested, the way she often did at events where her last name arrived before she did. Her mother had insisted she wear a particular dress, a deep emerald that brought out her eyes, a jeweled pin in her hair that had once belonged to her grandmother. She had felt, quite literally, draped in legacy. She had been stirring her drink absent-mindedly when Jonathan appeared beside her, suddenly and precisely, the way a chess piece is moved by a hand that knows exactly what it's doing. He had looked at her, really looked, and told her he was more interested in the woman who seemed uncomfortable in the corner than in the donors holding court in the middle of the room. At the time, she had taken it as disarming honesty. Now she wondered if he had practiced that line. If someone had told him, beforehand, that she hated these things, that she longed for smaller rooms and fewer eyes, and he had used that knowledge to paint himself as the only one who truly saw her. The officiant asked them to remember why they had chosen each other. She felt Jonathan's fingers tighten slightly around hers in a gentle cue, as if the shared squeeze might escort both of them into the proper emotional space. She let him. She had been play acting for her entire life, roles assigned by family, by expectation, by decorum. What was one more performance, if it meant buying herself time to think? He was watching her now. She could feel it. Even as he kept his face turned toward the officiant, his attention flickered back and forth, gauging her expression, measuring whether the woman beside him was still the woman he needed her to be. She met his gaze briefly, and for the first time he looked away before she did. Something in her eyes unsettled him. She could see it, a minute fracture in his practiced calm. Across the aisle, Harper stood in her place among the bridesmaids, bouquet held at chest level, posture elegant, face composed. To anyone else, she appeared to be the picture of supportive joy, the maid of honor glowing with happiness for her best friend. But Liana's eyes, sharpened by betrayal, noticed things she might have missed yesterday. The way Harper's jaw clenched every few minutes. The way her eyes lingered on Jonathan a breath longer than they should. The way her smile faltered whenever the officiant mentioned sacrifice and loyalty. She thought of the sleepovers they'd had as girls, sprawled on carpets with magazines and soda, inventing futures. They had talked about careers and travels and the men they would one day love, and Harper had always been the more romantic of the two. Harper had described grand gestures and impossible devotion. Liana had imagined quiet constancy and shared laughter. They had promised each other that no matter what happened, they would never be the kind of women who hurt other women for a man. Promises made in childhood often don't consider the gravity of adult loneliness. The officiant's voice shifted, signaling a transition. It was time for the vows. They had decided months ago to write their own. It had felt special then, intimate, a way to speak to each other in front of everyone and say, "I choose you, and here are my words to prove it." Liana had spent nights crafting hers in the glow of a bedside lamp, scratching out sentences that sounded too rehearsed, circling back to the core of what she felt. Trust, friendship, choosing each other not for what they represented but for who they were when no one else was watching. Now, the irony of that effort burned behind her ribs. The officiant nodded at Jonathan first. Guests shifted slightly, leaning forward. Cameras took their positions. This was the part people loved. The promises, the emotion, the delight of hearing how two lives planned to braid themselves together. Jonathan reached into his pocket for the small folded paper he had insisted he didn't need but kept anyway, claiming it was just for backup. He unfolded it with careful fingers, the page trembling only slightly. Liana wondered, for a strange moment, if the trembling came from love or from the pressure of everything riding on this day. The conversation behind the door suggested the latter. He began to speak. His words were good. Of course they were. Jonathan was not careless with language. He talked about seeing her at that first gala and knowing, within minutes, that she was different from anyone he had ever met. He mentioned the way she listened to people, the way she cared about things that didn't benefit her directly, The way her laugh made rooms feel less heavy. He told stories about small moments they had shared. A rainy Sunday spent cooking together, the time she insisted they rescue a dog from a shelter, the night they stayed up until dawn planning a trip they never took. He spoke of her kindness, her intelligence, her resilience. He said all the things a man is supposed to say when he is binding his life to a woman like her. The guests sighed at the right places, a few dabbed at their eyes. Liana's mother clutched her husband's hand tighter, her face soft with relief. Her father's shoulders loosened by degrees, tension easing as he listened to the groom praise his daughter. All the while, inside, Liana stood on a knife's edge between heartbreak and clarity. If she had not known about the corridor, these vows would have melted her. They had once melted part of her anyway, when Jonathan read her a dry-run version weeks ago in their living room. Back then, she'd heard love in his phrases. Today, she heard strategy. Every compliment, every tender recollection, rang differently now. Was he saying these things because he believed them, or because saying them smoothed the path to everything else he wanted? He ended with a flourish, promising to stand by her side through every season, to honor and cherish and protect her. He spoke of forever like a contract he intended to sign, and amend when necessary. The officiant smiled, thanked him, turned to her. And now, Liana, he said gently, your vows. She had not planned for this. Not this version of herself, standing in front of a man whose tender gaze hid sharp calculations. The vows she had written were tucked into the small bag the coordinator held somewhere behind her. They belonged to a woman who believed in the integrity of the person she was marrying. She was not that woman anymore, not entirely. She didn't want to stand there and pour pure words into a vessel she now knew was cracked. But a strange thing happened in the space between the officiant's invitation and her first breath. Her mind went still. All the chaotic loops of corridor words and bruised memories quieted, and beneath them she found something calm. Not acceptance, not surrender, something else. She could feel every eye on her. Guests who didn't know her well saw a poised bride pausing to collect herself, overcome by emotion. Those who knew her better, the ones who had seen her think before she spoke, who had watched her choose her words with care all her life, recognized that she was not searching for composure. She was assessing something. She inhaled, exhaled, and began. She did not look for the written vows. Instead, she let her own voice emerge, carrying words she had not rehearsed. She spoke slowly, as if listening to herself as she went, making decisions in real time about what story she would tell. She talked about crossing paths with a man who seemed to see past the noise of her world, about the comfort of finding someone who did not flinch in the shadow of her family's history. She acknowledged the ways he had been there for her father during a health scare last year, how he had made her mother laugh when the house felt heavier than usual. Those things had happened. They existed. She would not strip the past of its good moments just because the future had fractured. But then, as she continued, she shifted. She spoke less about him and more about herself, about what she believed love should be, how she had always imagined marriage not as an exchange of status or convenience, but as a quiet agreement between two flawed people to hold each other's truths gently. She said she had learned to value honesty even when it was uncomfortable, to listen to the instincts that whispered when something didn't align with her spirit. She talked about choice, about how standing at an altar should never feel like fulfilling an obligation, but like freely saying yes with eyes open. Her words were still soft, still shaped like vows, but their center of gravity had moved. Those with ears tuned to nuance might have felt the shift, the way a room feels when a storm is approaching, though the sky remains apparently clear. She promised to be true, to herself as much as to him. She promised to stay if the love between them remained honest, but she also, in a subtle way, promised herself that she would not stay if it didn't. Her father's brow furrowed slightly. Her mother glanced at him, sensing something but unsure what. Harper's grip on her bouquet tightened, knuckles paling. Jonathan watched her with a faint crease at the corner of his eyes, trying to decide whether these deviations from the expected script were anything to worry about or just nerves. She ended her vows not with a grand declaration of forever, but with something simpler, more conditional, and therefore more truthful. That she stood there that day not because her life would crumble without him, but because she believed they could build something worthy together, if they chose, every day, not to betray what they claimed to be. The officiant smiled, perhaps hearing only sincerity. The guests clapped softly, charmed by her humility. Jonathan kissed the back of her hand, making a show of being deeply moved. Inside, he was cataloging. Somewhere inside his calculating mind, a small red flag fluttered. Her words hadn't been the script he expected. They had contained a shadow of something inconvenient: independence. Rings were presented next, gleaming on a small satin pillow. A child from the family carried them with the solemnity of someone handing over a relic. Jonathan took hers first, his fingers steady now. As he slid the band onto her finger, he repeated the formal phrases about unending love and binding promises. The metal felt cold at first, then quickly warmed to her skin, like any foreign thing the body slowly accepts. She wondered whether she would ever look at that ring and see anything but this day, this knowledge, this fracture. She took his ring, holding it between thumb and forefinger. She looked at it for a fraction of a second longer than was typical, and in that pause she saw everything differently. This simple loop was meant to represent continuity, wholeness, no beginning or end. But in her mind, it now looked like a circle drawn in sand, vulnerable to the first strong wave. She slid it onto his finger. Their hands, for the briefest moment, were level, equal, adorned with the same symbol. Guest sighed. The photographer leaned in closer. Two people, matched bands, eyes shining. To an outsider, nothing was wrong here. The officiant reached the part everyone knew by heart. He asked if anyone had just cause why these two should not be joined in matrimony. It was a line people often treated as ceremony rather than real invitation. A few guests chuckled softly, half expecting some distant cousin to make a joke. No one moved. No one spoke. Liana felt the question pass through her like a gust. If she opened her mouth right then, if she lifted her eyes and said, "Yes, I do," the world she stood in would explode. She would not even need to explain. The trembling intensity in her voice would be enough to halt everything. The officiant would blink. Her parents would stiffen. Jonathan's grip would tighten, his mind racing to pull together a defense, a lie, a performance to salvage the investment. She could, right now, end it. Her throat tightened. Her tongue pressed against the back of her teeth with the effort of not moving. The moment stretched, thin as sugar glass. Then the officiant moved on, taking her silence as consent. And she let him. For now, the ceremony edged toward its peak. The pronouncement was only minutes away, the kiss, the applause, the scripted joy. She felt time narrowing, choices hardening. If she went through with it, she would be bound to this man in ways that would be more complicated to untangle later. If she stopped it here, she would protect herself but also ignite a firestorm that would leave her family scorched. The old part of her that hated spectacle wrestled with the newer part that demanded justice. Then, unexpectedly, something else entered her mind, her grandfather's voice. He had passed when she was 19, leaving behind not just money but a strange legacy of letters he had written to himself over the years, reflections bound in leather that she had discovered in his study one summer. He had lived through scandals and wars and market crashes, yet his advice had always been quiet. One line, in particular, had stayed with her. When you discover who someone truly is, don't rush to punish them. Watch what they do with the room you leave them. It will teach you more than anger ever will. Room. That word rooted itself in her now. What if, instead of detonating the ceremony, she finished it? Not out of surrender, but out of strategy. What if she gathered evidence rather than fury? What if she let Jonathan believe, for a little while longer, that his plan was succeeding, that she remained unsuspecting and pliable? People whose power rests on deception are never more careless than when they feel safe. And people who betray you expect immediate reaction. They rarely know what to do with silence. The officiant lifted his hands, his tone brightening. He declared them husband and wife, the phrase ringing out into the sunlit garden. Guests broke into applause, cheers rising like birds. Her mother cried in earnest now, tears of relief and joy. Her father's eyes were bright, his jaw set in that proud, aching line fathers wear when they hand their daughters into other men's arms. Jonathan leaned in to kiss her. To everyone else, it was the seal on their vows. To her, it felt like closing a book on the first part of a story and turning the page to a chapter only she knew was coming. His lips were familiar. She knew the pressure, the rhythm, the way he always placed his hand at the base of her neck like he'd found his home there. She let him. She kissed him back, not with the abandon of a woman fully in love, but with the controlled grace of someone performing in front of an audience. Somewhere in the front row, Harper clapped louder than necessary. If anyone looked closely, they might have seen that her smile was almost too wide, the muscles around her mouth too taut. But eyes were on the couple at the altar, not on the woman who had helped bend the story into this shape. As they turned to face the crowd, hands linked, rings gleaming, Liana felt the next phase begin. Rice or petals would be thrown, photos would be taken, toasts would be made. Each layer of the celebration would build the illusion higher. Two families united, a future secured, a narrative complete. She would play her part for now, not to protect Jonathan, not to protect Harper, not even entirely to protect her parents, though they mattered to her more than anyone in that garden. She would play her part because she needed time. Time to think, time to gather what she'd need, time to decide exactly how she wanted to reveal the truth she held. There is a difference, she realized, between being powerless and choosing to wait. Powerless women accept whatever story is handed to them. Women who choose to wait are often mistaken for powerless. Until they speak. The recessional began. They walked back down the aisle together, the reversed version of her earlier journey. Guests reached out to touch their hands, to brush her sleeve, to pat Jonathan's shoulder. Aunts pressed tissues into her clutch. Old family friends whispered blessings. Cameras captured the two of them in frame after frame. The happy couple bathed in light and confetti. Every step carried a new kind of tension now. She felt like an actress who had wandered backstage, seen the ropes and pulleys and sweat-stained hands that made the show possible, then returned to center stage knowing the illusion but still hitting her marks. At the end of the path, they were swept into a whirlwind of logistics. Signing the marriage certificate in a side room, posing for family photos beneath a floral arch, accepting congratulations, laughing at jokes. Jonathan moved through it all with the confident ease of a man who believed he had just secured his future. If he noticed that her laughter was a fraction quieter, that her eyes were more observant than adoring, he tucked it away as nerves. He thought the hard part was over. But the hard part, for her, had just begun. During the signing, as pens scratched against paper, she watched his hand. The clean strokes of his signature, the flourish at the end. She added her name where indicated, the letters forming with a steadiness that surprised her. The witnesses signed. The officiant added his mark. The document was folded, placed in a leather folder, and set aside. Legally and publicly, the deed was done. Inside, however, she made a different kind of mark. She took a mental photograph of every detail. The time, the room, the witnesses. She knew that if she chose, later, to untangle this binding, the fact that she had stood here under these circumstances would matter. Betrayal alters the moral weight of promises. She would not be the one who broke this. She would be the one who refused to live within a broken thing. Photos followed. Posed smiles in front of fountains, under trees, on the stone steps of the estate. Her cheeks began to ache. In each frame, Jonathan held her like precious cargo. In each frame, she tilted her head toward him just enough to convince the lens. In more than one shot, Harper stood a step behind them, close but not too close, her presence woven into the background of their story like an embroidered pattern. At one point, as the photographer adjusted lenses and relatives shuffled into new combinations, there was a brief pause. Harper approached with a tissue, reaching up to dab at an imaginary smudge near Liana's eye. Their faces were close, their expressions practiced. To anyone watching, it looked like the tender attention of a best friend. In that small space, Liana inhaled the perfume she had smelled on Harper since morning, floral and familiar. She thought of the scent she had once noticed on Jonathan's cuff and dismissed as some stranger's after a handshake. As the tissue brushed her cheek, Harper whispered something so low only Liana could hear. It was a simple sentence, the kind of throwaway comment someone might make to a nervous bride. But the tone carried a tremor. She didn't respond, not aloud. Instead, she met Harper's eyes, holding them for a heartbeat longer than usual. In that gaze, she allowed a fraction of what she knew to surface, like light breaking through deep water. Harper's pupils flared, confusion and fear chasing each other across her features. Then the moment passed. The photographer called them into position again. The show went on. By the time they moved into the reception tent, the sky had shifted to late afternoon gold. Lights twinkled above tables draped in linen, centerpieces glowed, glasses caught and held the light. The room hummed with the soft chaos of servers moving between chairs, the clink of cutlery, the swell of music tuning into something more celebratory. Speeches would soon begin. Toasts would be raised. Stories would be told. This, she knew, would be where she began. Not with an explosion. Not yet. With listening. With watching. With letting Jonathan and Harper act freely on the assumption that she remained their trusting, unsuspecting bride. Because only when liars feel safe do they reveal the full shape of their lies. And Liana, now, was no longer just a bride. She was a witness, quietly gathering everything she needed for the day she would decide to stop being silent. That day would come sooner than anyone in that tent imagined. And when it did, the room would learn that elegant revenge is not shouting or breaking glass. It is truth, delivered at the perfect moment, like a final line that changes the entire meaning of the story that came before. The reception tent glowed with warm gold, lanterns suspended like bottled stars. Guests entered in waves, delighted by the beauty, the grandeur, the elegance. Voices layered over one another, laughter rising, silverware chiming gently against plates. It was the kind of scene that looked like a painting of joy, one meant to be admired from afar, without noticing the cracks in the frame. Liana stepped into it with Jonathan's hand at her back, a touch that once comforted her, now felt like a reminder. To everyone else, it looked protective. To her, it felt like a claim he no longer deserved to make. Servers began placing dishes in front of guests. The clatter of service, the hum of conversation, The soft swells of classical strings from the live quartet filled the space like practiced orchestration. The world moved around her exactly as a wedding world should. Only she knew the truth suspended in the air. Jonathan guided her to the sweetheart table, an ornate two-seater facing the sea of guests, framed by draping florals and soft candlelight. They sat as if taking their thrones for the night, the newly crowned king and queen of a kingdom built on lace and expectation. Cameras clicked. Relatives cheered. She smiled for all of it, not out of dishonesty, but out of calculation. Revenge, real revenge, isn't loud. It's crafted. It's timed. It's delivered with such composure that the guilty never see it coming until the truth is standing right in front of them, reflected plainly in the shards of the world they broke. Jonathan leaned close, his voice soft and full of performative affection. "You doing okay, love?" She nodded, looking at him with eyes he was used to reading as devotion. But there was something else behind them now. Something he couldn't decode. Something he brushed aside in favor of the fantasy he needed to believe. That she was his, entirely and quietly, and that nothing could break her trust in him. He squeezed her hand again. She let him think he held her world. Let him sit in the false comfort of a man who believed he'd won. Because men who believe they've won stop watching the board. The appetizer course arrived. Congratulations drifted toward them like petals. People toasted privately, clinking glasses quietly among themselves. A pair of cousins giggled over a memory of her childhood. A family friend wiped tears at how grown she looked. A colleague of her father's praised Jonathan's intelligence, his potential, his promising future. Liana absorbed it all with a strange calm, like watching the final scenes of a movie she already knew the ending of. Then the speeches began. Her father rose first. He was not a loud man. He didn't need to be. His presence carried decades of authority, softened by love. When he spoke, the tent stilled, listening as though the air itself were waiting. He talked about Liana as a baby, the quiet way she entered the world, the determined way she had grown into it. He described her steady nature, her loyalty, her depth. He turned to Jonathan with sincerity and said he was grateful his daughter had found someone who cherished her. Liana felt the weight of that statement like a stone in her stomach. Jonathan smiled, placing a hand over his heart, nodding humbly at her father's praise. His performance was impeccable, measured, gracious, touched with enough emotion to please the crowd but not so much that it appeared theatrical. Only she, armed with knowledge he didn't know she held, saw the edges of calculation behind it. When her father finished, Jonathan stood for his groom's speech. He unfolded a fresh page, the second set of vows, rehearsed, polished. He spoke of gratitude, of joining her family, of feeling honored to be accepted into a legacy he respected deeply. He reached for her hand as he spoke of their future, painting visions of the home they would build, the family they might raise, the life he promised to dedicate himself to. She watched him the way a surgeon watches a monitor, not frightened, not panicked, simply studying the truth beneath the surface. The guests adored him for it. Somewhere near the back, Harper dabbed at her eyes theatrically. Most thought she was emotional because she loved her friend. Liana wondered if the tears were for herself, for the man who had chosen ambition as his bride and kept her as his shadow. Jonathan ended his speech with a kiss pressed to her temple. Gasps of adoration fluttered through the tent. She smiled again, the perfect bride. But her mind was elsewhere. She replayed the corridor. "I need her family. It opens doors. You smile, we keep quiet. You won't disappear from me." Each phrase landed like quiet detonations beneath the polished surface of the reception. Then came Harper's turn. She stood, tall and composed, raising her glass with the ease of someone accustomed to attention. Her speech was practiced. Of course it was. Filled with years of shared memories, stories about childhood pranks, teenage heartbreaks soothed with ice cream, college nights where they fell asleep on the same couch whispering dreams into the dark. It should have been beautiful. But Liana heard the subtext now, the way insincerity reveals itself once you know the truth. Harper's jokes about Jonathan's charm felt tinged with something darker. Her compliments about how perfect the couple looked landed like thinly veiled confessions. Her declaration that she had never seen Liana this happy twisted into irony so sharp it could cut the air. Liana watched her oldest friend perform devotion she no longer deserved. She studied the slight tremor in Harper's hand, the way her gaze flickered toward Jonathan between sentences, the faint sheen of sweat above her lip. People lie with their words, but they confess with their bodies. When Harper finished, the tent erupted into polite applause. She smiled a touch too wide, her teeth trembling at the edges. As she sat, Jonathan brushed her shoulder lightly, too naturally, a gesture only noticeable to someone who knew them both deeply. And Liana noticed. She felt no anger, strangely. Anger was too hot, too fast. What moved through her now was colder, quieter, more precise. a determination shaped like clarity, a calm so profound it bordered on unsettling, because she finally understood what her revenge would need to be, not an eruption of pain, not accusations, not chaos, but truth, truth delivered so unmistakably and gracefully that no one could deny it, not even the ones who had caused the wound. She did not want shouting, she did not want tears, she wanted recognition, the kind that settles on a room like a dropped veil, soft yet irreversible. Dinner unfolded in gentle waves. Guests clinked glasses, traded stories, drifted between tables. Jonathan was pulled away briefly for photos with his colleagues. Harper chatted animatedly with bridesmaids, laughing too loudly, drinking too quickly. And Liana watched, gathering, observing, listening. She noticed small things. The way Jonathan placed a hand at the small of Harper's back as he passed by. The text Harper checked under the table, her lips tightening. The glance they shared across the room, swift but too familiar. The way Harper reached for her champagne flute each time Jonathan moved near. Everyone else saw nothing, but liars always underestimate the one they betray. Toward the end of dinner, the coordinator approached Liana with a soft tap on her shoulder. "We're getting ready for your first dance," she whispered. "Whenever you're ready, just let us know." Of course, the first dance, the symbol, the centerpiece, the moment where two people look at each other as if the world pauses for them. She nodded calmly. Jonathan returned, slipping into his seat beside her. "Ready?" he asked, his smile warm, practiced. She looked at him, really looked, at the man she had chosen with innocence, chosen with trust, chosen with the certainty that he was a partner, not a predator. And in that moment, as the coordinator gestured for them to stand, she made the decision quietly, internally, without fanfare. She would let the first dance happen. She would let the guests watch. She would let Harper watch. She would let Jonathan hold her. And then, when the night turned towards speeches again, when the microphone came to her, she would speak. Not to wound, but to reveal. Not to destroy, but to free herself. Revenge, she realized, was not the fire she thought it would be. It was ice, clear, elegant, sharp enough to reclaim the breath stolen from her. Jonathan rose, offering his hand. She placed hers in his. The lights lowered. The music swelled. Guests murmured with delight as the couple made their way to the center of the dance floor. And with every step, Liana felt the truth crystallize inside her. This was not the part where she fell apart. This was the part where she began. The lights dimmed as though the world itself was exhaling, releasing the chaos of chatter and clinking glasses into a softer hush meant only for two people. The floor beneath Liana shimmered with reflections of the hanging lanterns, each one swaying gently like a heartbeat suspended in midair. Guests shifted in their seats, turning their bodies toward the center of the room. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the first dance, the signature tableau of any wedding. Two souls orbiting each other as if nothing beyond the glow mattered. Jonathan held out his hand, smiling with that careful, charismatic ease that had once been enough to still her nerves. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the familiar weight of his fingers wrapping around hers. It should have grounded her. Instead, it felt like touching a photograph, something that looked real but no longer had substance behind it. They walked together to the center of the dance floor. Each step echoed the vows they had just spoken, the promises that now felt split like a fork in a road she never realized they'd been walking differently. Her gown glided behind her like a soft wave unrolling across a beach, silk catching against silk, the fabric learning the shape of her new purpose. The music began, a slow, intimate melody chosen months ago when she had believed this day would be the most honest of her life. A song she used to play in her car during long drives home, imagining their future in soft snapshots. Coffee in quiet mornings, fingers brushing across countertops, laughter echoing in hallways, shared dreams becoming rituals. Back then, she had heard love woven in every note. Tonight, she heard something else, the sound of a story she had outgrown. Jonathan pulled her close, one hand against her back, the other holding hers with firm tenderness. People sighed at the sight. Cameras lifted. A few whispered that the couple looked like something out of a film, the kind that ends with soft focus and warmth. He dipped his head near hers and whispered, "You look unbelievable." The words brushed her ear like petals, but she felt nothing. They used to make her blush. Now they slid off her skin like water on glass. She lifted her face slightly, meeting his eyes. They were open, bright, expressive. A stranger might think they were filled with devotion. She knew now they were filled with calculation. A man silently aligning his future with the woman he believed he had secured. He moved with grace, and she matched him effortlessly. To the room, they danced like a couple born to complement each other's rhythm. But Liana wasn't dancing with the man she loved. She was dancing with the man he had revealed himself to be behind a door he didn't know she was standing near. She studied him openly, using the dance as cover. The slight tightness at the corners of his mouth, the confident rhythm of his steps, the hint of relief in his shoulders. He thought the ceremony had gone smoothly, that whatever nervousness he sensed in her earlier had lifted. He had no idea that she had heard everything. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, letting the world think she was overcome. From this vantage, she could see Harper sitting among the bridesmaids, a glass of champagne in her hand, knees crossed elegantly, dress cascading around her like she had been poured into it. Harper's face was soft, smiling, too smiling. Her eyes, trained on Jonathan and Liana, flickered with tension that only someone betrayed by her could read. Harper's hand tightened around her flute, her knuckles widening for an instant before she caught herself. The mask dropped back into place. A few bridesmaids whispered something to her, and she laughed, too loudly, then covered her mouth as if embarrassed. But there was nothing embarrassed about Harper tonight. There was only fear hidden beneath the shimmer of her makeup. Liana shifted her gaze back to Jonathan. His breath was steady, hers was measured. Her pulse beat not with panic but with a strange, expanding clarity, like she was waking up from a dream she did not know she'd been trapped inside. He twirled her gently. The room owed at the elegance. The skirt of her gown fanned out in soft arcs that caught the light and made her look like she was floating. But inside, her body felt anchored in something new, something that had weight and shape. The truth she now carried like a jewel hidden beneath her ribs. She did not crumble. That was the surprising part. Earlier, when she had first heard the kiss, the promise, the deception, a version of her had cracked. But that version had not survived the walk down the aisle. The version now dancing, this version, was stronger than she had ever been. Betrayal hadn't broken her. It had burned away the softness she hid behind, leaving steel. The chorus rose, and the dance deepened. Jonathan drew her closer, lips brushing her temple in a show of affection. She let it happen. Let the guests believe their story was untouched. Let Harper's stomach twist. Let the man holding her feel safe. Because safety makes liars sloppy, and sloppy liars confess without meaning to. As they moved, she noticed another detail, small, but devastatingly telling. When Jonathan thought she wasn't looking, he glanced toward Harper, just once, quick, but it was enough. Enough for Liana to see the flicker of connection lingering in that gaze, the unspoken question. Are we okay? Did I handle this correctly? Harper, not realizing anyone was watching, gave him the slightest nod. A nod. A shared language. A thread woven through the fabric of their secret. Liana felt something inside her shift. Not jealousy, not anger, but confirmation. It wasn't just the kiss. It wasn't just the words. It was the ease. The way they communicated like co-conspirators. The way neither of them looked uncertain about the wrongness of what they were doing. Their guilt was not fresh. It was practiced. Jonathan smiled down at her, thinking she was captivated. She allowed her lips to soften into a mirror of that smile. But not because she felt it. Because it was time to begin studying him as he studied the room. The music lowered, a quiet bridge in the melody, gentle and intimate. A moment meant for whispered promises. Jonathan leaned in again. I can't believe how lucky I am, he murmured. If she hadn't heard him in the corridor, she might have believed it. She might have clung to those words as proof of devotion. Instead, she heard them now as lines in a play he never thought she'd see behind the curtain of. She inhaled slowly, a breath so quiet even he couldn't feel it. The kind of breath taken before delivering a line that would change the tone of the act. She whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. You're lucky in ways you don't even realize yet. He pulled his head back slightly, confused. The smile faltered. His brows twitched with uncertainty. Before he could question it, the music swelled again and she moved seamlessly into the next turn, leaving him no room to press. The crowd erupted into applause as the dance neared its end, charmed by the couple's chemistry. When the final note faded, Jonathan dipped her theatrically, and the room burst into cheers and whistles. Liana smiled as the cameras flashed, but her eyes, only Harper saw them clearly, held something Harper hadn't anticipated. Awareness. Not suspicion. Not heartbreak. Not doubt. Awareness. Harper's smile faltered. Her hand jerked slightly. Her champagne sloshed over the rim. Liana straightened gracefully as Jonathan pulled her from the dip, her posture perfect, her expression soft enough to please the room. But inside, she was assembling pieces, quietly, carefully, without fear, because the truth had become her power now, and she was the only one in the room who understood exactly how much she held. Speeches were done, the first dance complete, the guests eager, the night gilded in the illusion of love, and Liana, for the first time since the corridor, felt calm. Not the fragile calm of a woman holding her heart together, but the chilling, resolute calm of a woman preparing her next move. The applause from the first dance still shimmered through the air like dust caught in a beam of light, slowly settling over the reception as guests returned to their meals, conversations, and curated joy. But for Liana, the sound faded the moment she stepped off the dance floor. The world around her softened, blurred at the edges, as though she were walking through a painting rather than a room filled with people who loved her. She smiled when expected, nodded politely when a guest stopped her to offer a blessing, let a distant aunt kiss her cheek and marvel at the glow of her happiness. She played her role with the precision of someone who had been raised to understand that appearances were not just fabric, they were currency. In this family, grace under pressure was not simply admired, it was required. But beneath the lace and the light, beneath the performance and the practiced elegance, something in Liana had shifted entirely. She felt it like a pulse under her skin, a quiet, growing clarity that hummed with its own rhythm. She excused herself after a few minutes, telling Jonathan softly that she needed a touch-up before the photographer's next round of portraits. He nodded, distracted by a guest whose handshake he returned with too much enthusiasm. Already, he was drifting into his new role, the favored son-in-law, the polished success story orbiting the power structure he'd fought so hard to marry into. She stepped away, not hurriedly, not nervously, just away. The tense-draped entrance opened into the soft darkness of the estate grounds, where strings of lights wound their way around ancient oak trees like constellations that had descended to earth for the evening. The air outside held a different temperature, cooler, sharper, alive. Liana inhaled deeply, the scent of grass and night air unspooling the tightness in her chest. She needed space, not to breathe, but to listen. There is a kind of truth that only reveals itself when the noise falls away. The sound of laughter faded behind her. Music dimmed to a distant hum. The estate's walkway stretched before her like a ribbon of shadow and gold. She followed it, silk hem whispering over gravel, the train of her gown trailing behind like a comet tail. Lantern light touched her veil, making it glow faintly, like a halo she no longer believed she deserved. But she did not walk toward the bridal suite. She walked toward the old greenhouse. The structure sat at the edge of the property, a relic from her grandmother's era, filled with glass panels fogged by age and vines climbing its frame like memories refusing to be forgotten. It had been her favorite place growing up, a sanctuary, a hiding place, a diary without pages, the one corner of the estate where truth seemed incapable of lying. As a teenager, she had come here to cry over heartbreaks she hadn't wanted anyone to see. As a young woman, she'd come here to think about decisions she wasn't ready to make. Even now, on the night her world had turned inside out, her feet guided her there instinctively, as though the greenhouse were the only witness she trusted to hold the truth without judgment. The door creaked slightly when she pushed it open. Soft warmth enveloped her, the lingering heat of sun-trapped air and blooming jasmine that always seemed to survive no matter how badly the winters tried to kill it. Inside, moonlight filtered through the glass roof, falling in fractured beams across potted ferns, climbing vines, and scattered petals. The space was lush, alive, peaceful, untouched by celebration, untouched by betrayal, untouched by Jonathan and Harper. She closed the door behind her, resting her back against it for a moment. The weight of the day pressed into her shoulders, not crushing her but grounding her. She had not cried. She had not trembled. Something stronger had taken root instead, a stillness that did not feel like shock, but like strength gathering itself. She walked between the rows of plants, her train sweeping gently behind her. Her fingers brushed leaves she had touched as a child. In this room, she didn't have to smile, didn't have to pose, didn't have to carry anyone's expectations but her own. Finally, at the back of the greenhouse, she reached the wooden bench her grandfather built decades ago, the one spot where the moon always poured through the glass at just the right angle to illuminate the whole world in silver. She sat. For the first time since the corridor, she allowed her breath to tremble. Not break, just tremble. A tremble holds truth. A break holds surrender. She was not surrendering. Her mind replayed the whispers behind the door. Not the kiss. Not even the words about love. It was the line that had struck deepest. I need her. Her family opens doors. That was the moment she had understood. Not that Jonathan didn't love her, though that wound was deep enough to scar, but that Jonathan had never loved the life with her. He loved the life through her. And that, somehow, was the sharper blade. She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, the veil sliding over her shoulder like a soft sigh. The silence in the greenhouse wrapped around her like a shawl, warm, familiar. In that silence, her heart spoke to her, but not in pleading, not in devastation, not in the language of shattered illusions. It spoke in questions. What am I supposed to do with this truth? Who do I become now that I know? Is this the moment I vanish, or the moment I appear? A distant noise interrupted her thoughts, a soft footstep on gravel outside. She straightened. For a moment, she wondered if Jonathan had noticed her absence, or if Harper, anxious and unraveling, had followed. But no, the footsteps were too light, too hesitant, too careful to belong to either of them. The greenhouse door eased open. Light spilled in. It was her younger cousin, the only one who ever found her here as a child. Her cousin paused, eyes widening at the sight of the bride alone in a place no bride should be alone on her wedding night. Her expression flickered with worry, but she didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and held out something that made the air still completely. A phone. Liana's phone. "You left this at the prep suite," her cousin whispered softly. "I thought you'd want it." Before she could thank her, the cousin had retreated, leaving her in the warm silence again. Liana looked down at the device, unthreatening, small, a rectangular piece of glass and metal that had never meant anything more than convenience and distraction. Tonight, it held destiny. The screen lit up when she touched it. One notification glowed at the top. A voice message, from Jonathan, sent an hour before the ceremony. Her chest tightened. She pressed play. And the greenhouse, her sanctuary, her truth room, filled with Jonathan's voice speaking words never meant for her ears. Not the ones she overheard. Worse, far worse. Jonathan's voice, low and impatient. "Make sure she stays calm. Today can't fall apart. If she senses anything, the whole plan is dead. Just keep her steady. I'll handle the rest." Harper's voice, tense. "You promise this won't get messy?" Jonathan's exhale. "It won't." She signs, we smile, papers go through, and after that, we do what we talked about. A pause. A soft, unmistakable sound. A kiss. Another pause. Then Jonathan's voice, thick with satisfaction. "We just need her to say, 'I do.' After that, her life becomes ours to shape." Silence. The message ended. The room held its breath. Liana didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. Her body went still in a way that didn't feel like shock anymore. It felt like awakening wrapped in absolute clarity. The truth was no longer something she overheard. It was something she owned. For a long moment, she sat with it. The betrayal, the scheme, the audacity, the arrogance. But beneath all of it, something else bloomed. Strength. Not the fragile kind people assign women who endure. The sovereign kind people never expect women to wield. The kind of strength that doesn't break, it transforms. She rose slowly from the bench, the gown whispering in the quiet, the air shifting around her like the atmosphere before a storm. She walked to the greenhouse door with a steadiness she did not have an hour ago. Her reflection caught in one of the panels. A bride, yes, but something more now. A woman standing in the ashes of an illusion and finding herself unburned. She stepped out into the night. The path to the reception glowed faintly ahead, lined with lanterns that flickered like tiny warnings. Her heartbeat was calm, her mind, clear, her purpose, sharpened. She wasn't going back to the party to explode. She was going back to observe one last time, and then dismantle the world Jonathan had tried to build out of her life. Not with chaos, but with truth sculpted into something so precise, so undeniable, so unforgettable. It would silence every guest in that tent the moment she chose to speak. And tomorrow, the world would whisper her name with awe. She began walking back. The revenge forming inside her was not an act of rage. It was an act of reclamation. The kind only a woman who has finally discovered the depth of her own worth can deliver. The walk back to the reception felt different now, as though the path itself were aware of the shift inside her. The lanterns glowed with a muted warmth, their flickering light dancing across the stones like small, knowing eyes. The night air wrapped around her, cool and steady, carrying the faint hum of celebration from the tent ahead. It wasn't joy she walked toward anymore. It was understanding. Her gown whispered across the gravel, each step deliberate, softened by the thickening clarity in her chest. She held her phone loosely in her hand, the screen dark now but still pulsing with the echo of Jonathan's voice message. Those words had settled inside her like ink, already drying into a shape she could never unsee. After that, her life becomes ours to shape. She had heard many cruel things in her life, whispered gossip, sharp criticisms, jealous remarks. But nothing had ever cut her with such quiet precision as that sentence. Not because it belittled her, but because it revealed exactly how Jonathan saw her, not as a partner, but as leverage. And the revelation did not break her, it refined her. By the time she neared the glowing tent, her emotions had organized themselves into a kind of elegant order. The panic had burned off. The confusion had evaporated. What remained was a deeper, more profound awareness, not of the betrayal, but of herself, who she had been, who she was now, who she would allow herself to become. As she reached the edge of the tent, the laughter inside spilled toward her, bright and careless. People were enjoying dessert, leaning back in their chairs, glasses clinking softly. The string quartet had shifted into something livelier, a tune layered with violin plucks and soft piano notes. The world inside the tent believed itself to be witnessing the start of a perfect life. She paused at the entrance. The flap of the draped fabric swayed lightly in a breeze, and she could see just enough of the interior to notice how the space glowed. Chandeliers catching the gold in the linens, candles flickering like tiny suns on each table, faces illuminated with the rosy warmth that comes from good food, wine, and witnessing love. For a brief second, she let herself imagine what this night had once been meant to feel like. The joy she had expected, the safety she had assumed, the tenderness she had hoped to celebrate. A wedding is not just a ceremony. It is a promise wrapped in applause. The bride is supposed to walk into the reception with a full heart, not a fractured reality. But grief didn't bloom inside her. Not now. Perhaps later, in the privacy of her own mind, she would mourn the version of herself she had been when she woke up this morning. But right now, standing at the entrance to her own reception, she felt strangely centered, almost as though the truth, instead of damaging her, had made room for her to see every corner of the room with precision. She took one step forward, then another, slipping back into the glow without making a sound. No one noticed her return at first. People were too wrapped in their conversations, too busy praising the sea bass or marveling at the cake or telling stories about her childhood. The orchestra played on, unaware that the bride walking under its melody was no longer the woman it had serenaded earlier. She threaded her way through the crowd with the calm of someone who knew she no longer owed the night her innocence. She stopped at a table where distant cousins were laughing over an inside joke. She smiled politely. She moved on. Her senses sharpened. Everything felt magnified. The crispness of candle flames, the crisp linen beneath her fingertips as she brushed a table edge, the subtle perfume of jasmine and vanilla drifting through the room. Even the air seemed clearer, as though it had been stirred by the truth. Her eyes found Harper first. Still seated at the bridesmaids' table, Harper was laughing too loudly, her hand fluttering near her chest in faux surprise at something another bridesmaid had said. But there was strain in her smile, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a tightness in her shoulders that betrayed everything her expression tried to mask. Harper touched her phone, glanced at the entrance, then back at the dance floor with restless nerves. She was looking for Jonathan, looking for reassurance, looking for alignment. Liana watched her quietly. For years, she had seen Harper as her mirror, a reflection of girlhood, of friendship, of secrets shared in whispered midnights. But now, seeing her across the room, the mirror shattered. She no longer saw the girl who sat with her through heartaches or helped her decide what dress to buy for a college formal. She saw the woman who had stood behind a door and kissed her fiancé before her wedding. Not with hesitation, not with guilt, with expectation. Liana's gaze moved to Jonathan next. He stood near her father, engaged in conversation with two businessmen who had always admired his ambition. He was smiling that charismatic, eager smile, the one that made older men pat his back and younger men admire him. He nodded at something her father said, leaning in respectfully. He looked like the perfect son-in-law, the perfect groom, the perfect addition to her family. But she heard something else now in his laughter, a hunger, a sense of entitlement, a belief that he had earned access to a world he had not built. He didn't look worried, and that, strangely, comforted her. It confirmed he did not suspect her silence. He did not know she had heard the conversation, did not know she had found the message, did not know his entire plan had unraveled the moment he pressed send. There is power in being the only person in a room who knows the truth. She moved to the drink station and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was steady, her breath controlled. She took a sip and felt the coolness travel down her spine like a line drawn with ice. Behind her, she heard two older guests discussing the elegance of the night. "I've never seen a bride so calm," one said warmly. "If only more young women carried themselves like her," the other added. She smiled faintly at that. Calm could be many things. Grace, poise, acceptance. Tonight, calm was strategy. She made her way toward the terrace, where the night air poured through like a cool tide. A group of guests stood near the railing, admiring the view of the gardens. She joined them briefly, looking outward, letting the quiet space between music and chatter settle around her. Out there, in the dark expanse lit by soft lamps and drifting fireflies, she felt something like alignment rising in her chest. She wasn't simply preparing for revenge anymore. She was preparing for truth to walk the room like a ghost suddenly made visible. Not yet. Not now. Timing mattered. Revenge without timing is noise. Revenge with timing is art. She turned back toward the reception, scanning the space with new eyes. Patterns emerged. Details sharpened. People revealed themselves without meaning to. She watched Jonathan shake hands with a politician he'd always wanted an introduction to. She watched Harper's reaction to that moment. Pride slipping into panic, fear curling around jealousy. She watched her parents glowing with exhausted joy. She watched bridesmaids stealing glances at her, noticing something different in her posture but unable to name it. The entire room was a tableau of illusions she could now see through like thin veils. And finally, she reached the quietest realization of the night. The truth she held was not meant to end the wedding. The truth she held was meant to end the lie. She wasn't here to destroy her life. She was here to reclaim it. And to reclaim something, you must first understand its shape. Her shape, tonight, was not victim or scorned bride or heartbroken woman. Her shape was evolution. As the night deepened, a subtle signal went through the room, the DJ announcing that speeches were resuming soon. A ripple of anticipation moved across the tables. Some guests stood to stretch. Others refreshed their drinks. And there, in the middle of it, a pure and undeniable understanding settled into her bones. Her moment was approaching. Not the final moment. Not the explosion. Not yet. But the shift, the first and quiet turning of the tide. She felt it. The room didn't know it yet. Jonathan didn't know it yet. Harper didn't know it yet. But something was coming. Not because she wanted vengeance, but because she deserved truth. And truth, when spoken by the right voice at the right time, doesn't just silence a room. It transforms it. She lifted her chin slightly. Her shoulders softened. Her heartbeat slowed into rhythm. A new stillness washed over her. Not resignation, not hesitation, but readiness. The night wasn't over, and the bride was no longer here to be celebrated. She was here to be heard. The hum of returning conversation rippled softly through the reception as guests settled back into their seats. Silverware chimed gently, wine glasses refilled themselves with patient hands, and the violinist lifted her bow, letting a delicate thread of melody drift across the room. The atmosphere felt calm, predictable, rehearsed, the way weddings are meant to feel when the most tender moments have already passed. But for Liana, the night had only just begun. She stood near the edge of the tent, her silhouette outlined by lantern light, observing the room with a quiet intensity. She knew now that her presence alone carried power. She wasn't the bride who had walked down the aisle hours earlier. She was the woman who had walked out of the greenhouse reborn. A woman who had finally seen the truth without looking away. And truth, once seen, changes the way you inhabit every room. Jonathan found her quickly. Of course he did. He had always been attuned to where she stood, not out of love, she realized now, but out of strategy. He approached with a bright smile, one arm looping naturally around her waist. To anyone watching, they looked like a newlywed couple savoring the glow of the night. "You disappeared on me," he whispered lightly, warm breath brushing her ear. "Everything okay?" His voice was affectionate, but his eyes searched her face with something subtler. A flicker of suspicion, a hint of insecurity. A man who sensed, on some instinctive level, that something in her had shifted, though he couldn't name it. She tilted her head gently, allowing her cheek to brush his jaw in a gesture that felt almost tender. "I just needed a moment," she said softly, the truth cloaked in simplicity. Jonathan smiled again, reassured by the calm in her voice. His hand tightened on her waist, not possessively, but confidently. The confidence of a man who believed the ceremony had cemented everything. She turned with him as he guided her back toward the tables, feeling his fingers settle lightly along her spine. And that was when she made her next decision. She would give him exactly what he expected from her, right up until the moment he least expected it. The DJ tapped the microphone, his voice rising above the hum of conversation. "If everyone could return to your seats," he announced with warm enthusiasm, "we're going to begin the final round of speeches from our loved ones." Guests applauded. A few whistled. Chairs shuffled. The energy lifted. The structure of the evening clicked into place. A rhythm people recognized. The father of the groom would speak. A college friend would share a story. And then, of course, the bride. Liana's moment was scripted into the ceremony. It was also her moment to rewrite the script. But not here. Not yet. Not this speech. She would wait for the one moment where truth carried maximum clarity, maximum impact, and minimum confusion. She would not weaponize chaos. She would wield precision. Jonathan offered her an encouraging look, unaware of the storm gathering silently behind her eyes. Harper, seated at the bridesmaids' table, caught Jonathan's glance and then Liana's. Her expression faltered for the briefest second. Not guilt, but anxiety. The kind of anxiety born from living inside a lie so long you forget how fragile it is until someone approaches with too much calm. A couple of bridesmaids leaned toward Harper, whispering something about the next speech, and Harper forced a smile that looked like it had been painted onto her face rather than grown from within. Her mask was slipping. "Good." Liana stepped into place beside Jonathan as the groom's father took the microphone. He was warm, jovial, praising Jonathan's persistence, his work ethic, his ambitious heart. People laughed at the anecdotes. They nodded at the sincerity. It was a speech meant to inspire confidence in the man her family had accepted. She listened carefully, her ears tuned differently now. She wasn't listening to the words. She was listening for the gaps. The gap between who Jonathan was and who he pretended to be. The gap between Harper's composure and her unraveling. The gap between expectation and truth. When the father finished, applause swelled. Jonathan clapped heartily. Harper clinked glasses too quickly, champagne spilling slightly over the rim. Then came the next speaker, a mutual friend from college, telling a story about a road trip the two of them had taken. The room laughed. The energy eased. But Liana felt the air shift again. She sensed movement behind her, a soft step, a flutter of perfume. Harper was approaching from the side, her smile delicate, eyes guarded. She leaned in just close enough for the appearance of affection but far enough that Jonathan would not overhear. "You okay?" Harper whispered, her voice so gentle it almost sounded sincere. "Almost." Liana turned her head slowly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness Harper did not expect. Harper blinked, unsettled by the calm, perhaps expecting tears, anger, or confusion, emotions she would have known how to manage, how to deflect, how to soothe. But this calm, this quiet, knowing stillness, it unsettled her. "I'm perfect," Liana whispered, her voice warm enough to confuse, cool enough to warn. Harper swallowed. Her throat moved nervously. She lingered only a moment before slipping back into her seat, but not before placing a reassuring hand on Liana's arm. A gesture that trembled too much to convince anyone who understood trembling. Liana let her go. She didn't need to confront Harper yet. Harper would reveal herself naturally. People engaged in deception always do. The DJ announced her name next. The bride's speech. The room erupted with applause, expecting something warm, emotional, tender, expecting a love note dressed in gratitude. Her mother dabbed at her eyes already. Her father smiled proudly, tipping his head toward her. Liana stepped forward, hearts lifted, Jonathan's most of all. He believed this was his moment to shine again in her words. She felt his anticipation like heat behind her, and she surprised him by giving the room exactly what it expected. Her speech was flawless, soft, sincere, measured. She thanked her parents for raising her with grace. She thanked Jonathan's family for welcoming her. She praised her bridesmaids for standing beside her. She told a story about the early days of dating Jonathan, one that had always made her smile, and she delivered it with such warmth that even Harper relaxed slightly, confusion knitting itself into her features. Jonathan beamed. The guests melted. Cameras flashed. Nothing in her voice hinted at fracture. Nothing in her tone betrayed truth. Nothing in her eyes gave away the revelation brewing inside her. She ended with a toast to love, the kind built on honesty and unwavering loyalty. A few guests nodded, touched by the line. A few raised glasses. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder, pride radiating from him. And it happened then, the exact moment she wanted. Her words echoed in the room. Love built on honesty. She saw Harper's jaw tighten subtly. She saw Jonathan's fingers twitch. She saw her father's gaze sharpen, just slightly, as though he sensed an unspoken layer beneath her voice. She delivered the final line with a smile so serene even the photographer lowered his camera to simply admire her. And when the applause rose up around her like a tide, she did not feel like the bride anymore. She felt like the architect. She took her seat again beside Jonathan, sipping her water, letting the room bask in the warmth of her speech. Harper leaned back in her chair, exhaling shakily. Jonathan grinned at the crowd, reveling in the praise. And Liana smiled inwardly, because she knew something they didn't. Tonight, she had just shifted the narrative. Quietly, elegantly, irretrievably. She had not revealed the truth yet, but she had set the foundation. And the moment of revelation, the moment that would silence every guest in this room, would arrive when the night was at its peak, when eyes were brightest, when emotions were highest, when Harper and Jonathan felt safest. Because the destruction of a lie is most powerful when the lie is convinced it has already won. And that moment, the one where truth would no longer whisper but roar, was approaching with every breath she took. The reception had reached that golden stretch of evening when joy grows louder, when wine glows warmer, when everyone believes the best moments have already happened and all that remains is celebration. That illusion, that lull, was precisely why the next part of the night mattered. It was the moment before the storm, the pause that comes when a room has no idea that one woman is walking through it with her eyes wide open. Liana watched the night unfold with a stillness that felt almost supernatural. She sat beside Jonathan, who basked in the glow of accomplishment, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. Guests drifted freely, hugging relatives, clinking glasses, taking selfies by the floral arch. Laughter rose like lanterns into the air. The dance floor pulsed with soft energy. Everything was rehearsed elegance. Everything was the illusion of happily ever after. But beneath that polished veneer, subtle cracks began to reveal themselves. Not from anything she said, not from any confrontation, but from the simple fact that she no longer participated in the illusion. And liars can feel when the person they depend on stops believing them. Jonathan placed his hand lightly on her thigh under the table, a gesture meant to be intimate, reassuring, proprietary. She didn't flinch. She didn't lean in. She simply let his hand rest there without response. That alone was enough for him to glance sideways, searching her expression the way someone searches a room for lost keys. She noticed. She also noticed the way Harper watched that same gesture from across the room. Eyes sharpened, smile frozen, fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute as though she needed to anchor herself to something. Harper's fear had grown in the last hour. It shimmered beneath her beauty, under her blush, behind every laugh she forced too loudly. Fear tends to reveal itself in repetition. She kept fixing her hair, checking her phone, smoothing her dress, looking toward Jonathan as if the threads of her disguise were fraying and she needed him to hold them together. That was the problem with betrayal. It ties two people together with a cord that only fear can tighten. And Liana was watching that cord strangle them. She excused herself gently, standing with the grace of a woman who wanted to greet another table. Jonathan nodded, distracted by the praise of a guest who slapped him jovially on the back. Harper's eyes followed Liana for a moment, trying to read her intentions the way someone might study a shadow trying to determine if it belonged to something harmless or dangerous. She crossed the reception hall slowly, greeting guests with small, polite smiles. Her walk was measured, her breath steady, her mind impossibly clear. Each step was a reminder that she was not running from anything. She was moving toward something, a truth she intended to craft with precision. She visited the table of her cousins first, engaging in soft conversation. They complimented her speech, her elegance, the beauty of the night. She thanked them, genuine warmth in her eyes, not because of the wedding, but because these were the people who had loved her without condition, without motive. As she stood there, she caught sight of the photographer snapping candid shots of the room. He paused near the sweetheart table, capturing Jonathan in deep conversation. Jonathan laughed and leaned back, revealing a bit more of himself than he intended. People often reveal the most in unguarded moments, the tilt of a head, the flash of a smirk, the looseness of posture. Jonathan looked satisfied. Harper looked fragile. And Liana, she looked free. She moved toward another group, her father's old colleagues, listening to stories about her childhood she'd heard 1,000 times. Her smile was soft, her posture relaxed. Someone watching closely might believe she radiated the serene glow of a fulfilled bride. But Harper saw something else. When Liana turned, their eyes met. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. Harper's spine stiffened. Her expression flickered with something like dread. She rose from her seat subtly, drifting toward the exit of the tent as though pulled by instinct, not intention. The instinct to run or recover or breathe. Liana followed at a distance, curiosity tempered by calm. The air outside felt cooler, brushing her skin like a whisper. Harper stood at the far edge of the terrace, the night sky casting her figure in soft contrast. She believed she was alone. She wasn't. Liana approached slowly, not to confront, but to observe. Harper was gripping her phone with both hands now, her breathing noticeably uneven. One message, one ripple, one whisper of truth, and Harper's entire mask had begun to crack. Harper typed something quickly, deleted it, typed again, deleted it again. Her shoulders trembled slightly, the way someone trembles when fear is no longer ignorable. She exhaled loudly, bracing herself on the railing. And then she made the mistake that revealed everything. She raised her hand to her chest, clutching the locket she'd worn for years. A locket she had once told Liana held a photo of the two of them from childhood. Liana stepped closer, silent, until her presence brushed Harper's awareness like a shift in the air. Harper froze. She turned, and in her eyes, Liana saw it, the full, unfiltered terror of someone who knew their world was held together by lies so thin a single truth could slice them open. "Hey," Harper whispered, voice cracking slightly. You okay?" Liana looked at her, really looked at her. The childhood friend who had once braided her hair before school. The teenager who had whispered dreams under blankets. The woman who had stood beside her through loss, through triumph, through quiet years. And yet, here she stood now, trembling, deceit unraveling in her eyes. "I'm perfect," Liana said softly, her voice warm enough to calm, cool enough to warn. "Just taking in the night." Harper nodded too quickly. "Yeah, me too. It's a big day." "It is," Liana replied gently. "Bigger than most people realize." Harper swallowed hard, the locket trembling against her chest. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe a confession, maybe a plea, maybe a lie crafted to protect herself. But no words came, because Liana didn't step toward her. She simply smiled. A small, serene, devastating smile. And Harper's face crumpled, just for a moment, in the quiet realization. She knows. Not in words, in presence, in truth. Harper stepped back, panic rippling through her posture. Liana didn't follow. She didn't need to. Harper walked away first. Because betrayal makes you run. But truth makes you stop. Liana stood there for a moment, inhaling the night air. She let the wind carry the last remnants of her old life away. Beyond the terrace, lanterns flickered through the garden, lighting the path back to the tent. The song changed. Guests laughed. Jonathan's voice rose above the crowd again. She walked slowly back inside. Not to confront, not to accuse, not to expose, not yet. She returned to finish watching how people moved inside the lie. The last pieces she needed were assembling themselves. In gestures, in glances, in nervous spirals. Jonathan noticed her return and lifted his glass toward her with a grin. She returned the gesture with a small nod, her expression unreadable. The room continued to dance, to toast, to celebrate. And Liana, stepping into the center of her own destiny, understood something powerful. Tonight would not end with broken glass or rage. It would end with revelation, elegant, undeniable, unforgettable. The truth she carried was no longer a burden. It was her crown, and she would wear it before the night was over. When Liana stepped back inside the tent, it was as though she were stepping into a softened dream, one where colors were bright, voices were warm, but everything lacked the weight it used to carry. The chandeliers glowed with golden fervor, casting shimmering reflections over wine glasses and polished silver. Guests drifted through the space like dancers in an elaborate ballet, unaware they were performing inside a story whose ending had already shifted beneath their feet. And she, dressed in white, steady as moonlight, walked among them with eyes that understood what none of them could see. Her return did not go unnoticed. Jonathan spotted her first. His face lit up with the kind of pleased pride that belonged to a groom confident the night was unfolding in his favor. He waved her over with easy charm, holding out a glass of champagne he'd already collected for her. She approached with a gentle smile, accepting the flute without drinking from it. The golden liquid caught the candlelight, glowing softly like liquid gold. She tilted it slightly, watching the surface ripple. A mirror disturbed. "Everything good?" Jonathan asked, brushing his thumb along the side of her hand. Everything in his demeanor said "I expect yes." Everything in her silence said "You have no idea." "Yes," she replied calmly, just one word. But somehow, it made something in his eyes flicker. She wasn't giving him the emotional warmth he was accustomed to, and men like Jonathan, men who build their self-worth on the reactions of others, always notice when admiration begins to drift away, even by an inch. He slid his arm casually around her waist, leaning in. "You disappeared earlier," he murmured. "I thought maybe you needed me." There had been a time when that sentence would have melted her, folded her gently into the safety of his arms. But now she heard it differently. The assumption, the ownership, the belief that he was the center of her orbit. She gave a faint, serene smile. "I found what I needed." Jonathan paused, just long enough for a micro-expression to reveal itself, worry flashing in the corner of his eye, then smoothed over in an instant. But Liana saw it, because she was looking for it, because she understood now that his tells were small, precise, easy to miss, unless you had finally opened your eyes to them. Harper saw her return next. She froze mid-conversation, laughter dying on her lips. Her eyes locked onto Liana's face with a fear that bordered on pleading. She looked like someone expecting to be confronted, cornered, exposed at any moment. The way her fingers clutched the napkin in her lap betrayed how tightly she was holding her own unraveling pieces. Liana held her gaze for a single breath, just long enough for Harper to know that the silence between them had shifted into something significant. Then Liana looked away, not dismissively, but deliberately. That choice, that simple, elegant choice, was enough to make Harper inhale sharply and press a hand to her chest as though steadying her pulse. The absence of confrontation was its own kind of confrontation. The lack of reaction was its own kind of revelation. Guilt lives loud inside silence. The DJ announced that another round of dancing was about to begin, encouraging guests to fill the floor. Couples rose, some eager, some hesitant, some simply following the gentle pull of music. The room began to move again, swirling with soft rhythms and drifting laughter. Jonathan turned to Liana with an inviting grin. "Come on," he said, tugging her gently toward the dance floor. "We should give them something to talk about." She allowed him to guide her, let her hand slip into his, because she needed to see him closely again, needed the proximity, needed the evidence that always surfaces when liars believe the audience still applauds them. They moved to the center of the dance floor, joining other couples. The music shifted into a soft, slow song, one that would have made her heart swell a day ago. Tonight, it was simply sound. Jonathan pulled her close, assuming her body would mold into his as it always had. But she kept her posture subtly upright, not rigid, not cold, simply not yielding. Enough for him to sense something was different. "Hey," he whispered against her temple, "don't go quiet on me." She turned her head slightly, letting moonlight catch her profile. I'm not quiet, she murmured. I'm just listening. He chuckled lightly, but it held no confidence. To what? To things I didn't notice before. Jonathan's steps faltered. Only by half an inch, the kind of misstep no guest would see, but enough for Liana to feel him stiffen beneath his practiced grace. For the first time all evening, he wasn't playing a part. He was reacting, and reactions were far more honest than words. Liana, he said gently, if something's wrong, you can tell me. She smiled faintly. When something is wrong, you don't always have to tell someone. Sometimes you just have to let them show you. A quiet dread slipped across his face, so faint it vanished the moment she blinked. But she saw it. Oh, she saw it. That was the thing about truth. Once you learn to recognize it, you can see it even when someone tries to bury it under charm. They danced a little longer, surrounded by swirling gowns and soft lights. Couples laughed softly around them, oblivious to the unraveling happening at the heart of the floor. Then Jonathan made a mistake. He glanced toward Harper. A quick check, a silent question, a flicker of fear, and Harper, trembling in her chair, looked back. It was nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice. But to Liana, it was a confession. Without a word spoken, without a scene created, without a single accusation, they told her everything. She didn't stop dancing. She didn't pull away. She didn't even change expression. She simply tucked that moment carefully into the growing collection of truths she was gathering. Truths she would soon use with precision. The song ended. Applause fluttered through the ballroom. Jonathan stepped back, searching her face again. You're different tonight, he whispered. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a quiet strength he had never seen. I'm exactly who I've always been, she said softly. You just weren't looking. Jonathan swallowed hard, unsettled. His smile faltered again, then returned, forced this time. He brushed her cheek with his thumb, but there was no warmth behind it. You're scaring me a little, he murmured. Good, she replied, with such calm it froze him in place. You should be. She turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just gracefully stepping away as though she were simply going to greet guests. Jonathan stayed where he was, blinking, processing, his breath uneven. Harper saw his reaction and panicked. Her hand flew over her mouth, her chest heaved, and she rose from her seat abruptly, heading toward the exit of the tent again. Liana followed neither of them. She didn't need to. She returned to the center of the room, letting the guests swirl around her. Laughter, music, dancing, celebration. But beneath all of that, she felt something else emerging. The room was changing. Not visibly, not loudly, but spiritually. There is a point in every story where the audience feels something different in the air, even if they cannot name it. A point where tension vibrates beneath the surface, where eyes shift, where instinct whispers that something is approaching. The reception had reached that point. People began to glance at her more often. Some sensed something altered inside her. Some whispered subtle questions. Some paused mid-laughter when they caught the expression in her eyes. Not sadness, not anger, something clearer. Self-possession. The kind that comes when a woman finally decides to stop living inside someone else's script. And that was when she realized. The night would not end with a single moment. It would end with a series of revelations that only she had the courage to orchestrate. Jonathan was cracking. Harper was unraveling. The room was shifting. And she, in her calm, controlled silence, was now the gravity everything revolved around. This was no longer their story. It had become hers. And the next move she made would change the entire trajectory of the night, and everyone in it. The night had grown ripe with celebration, swollen with the kind of warmth that weddings are built to carry. But beneath that glow, something cooler moved through the air. A shift so subtle that only someone deeply attuned to human truths would recognize it. And that someone was her. Liana moved through the reception like a moon guiding tides. Guests leaned toward her without realizing why. Conversations paused when she passed. Even laughter seemed to soften at her proximity, as though the room was adjusting its rhythm to hers. This wasn't power she had demanded. It was power she had become. When a woman stops participating in deception, her silence changes the atmosphere. People feel it. Instincts sharpen. A delicate unease begins to seep through the cracks of laughter. And that was exactly what was happening now. The DJ announced the next segment of the night, a soft transition into the open-floor toasts, the casual speeches guests could give if they wished. It was meant to be light-hearted, unexpected, fun. Someone joked about preparing jokes. Someone else raised a drink. The room hummed with anticipation. Jonathan didn't look nervous yet, but he looked alert. He kept glancing toward her as though she were a compass he couldn't stop checking. Harper, however, was unraveling quietly from the periphery. Her movements were jerky, her smile, brittle. Her hands shook when she poured herself another drink, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She was running on fear now, not celebration. she wasn't the only one. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward Harper every few minutes. Small checks, anxious checks. Invisible threads tied the two of them together. They were subtle, but to Liana, who now saw with unveiled clarity, those threads glowed like wires ready to spark. She didn't move toward either of them. She didn't need to. Her power wasn't in confrontation. Her power was in presence. And tonight, her presence was reshaping the room. One of her uncles took the microphone next, delivering a short and humorous toast about childhood memories. Guests laughed heartily. Someone clapped him on the back when he returned to his seat. The moment felt harmless, but Liana could feel the tension tightening beneath it, like a violin string being twisted a half turn too far. Her mother leaned over to her father, whispering something. Her father glanced across the room at her, noticing the composure in her face, the quiet gravitational pull she now held. Parents know when something is shifting in their children, even if they can't name what. When the microphone became available again, a bridesmaid jumped up playfully. Then a cousin. Someone told a funny story about the bride's childhood habit of rescuing stray animals from the backyard. The laughter was warm, genuine, untainted. But then came the moment the universe had been orchestrating all night. The microphone was placed back on the stand at the center of the dance floor, just resting there, waiting. No one reached for it. Not yet. Instead, people looked around, expecting the next volunteer to rise. That's when the quiet, that delicate, expectant quiet, fell upon the room. A quiet that wasn't empty, but charged. A quiet that carried the weight of possibility. A quiet that recognized a shift in the bride's breathing before she even stood. She rose slowly from her chair. Not abruptly, not dramatically, simply rising like someone who had remembered her name after forgetting it for too long. Conversations stuttered. Chairs creaked lightly. Eyes turned toward her almost instinctively. Jonathan straightened in his seat. Harper's breath caught audibly. At the tables, guests looked up with soft smiles, expecting more sweetness, more sentiment, more bridal glow. But the glow around Liana was different now. Not warm, not cold, refined. A glow born from truth rising quietly through her bones. She walked to the center of the dance floor, her gown moving gracefully around her, each step steady. The chandeliers sprinkled light across her veil, making her look almost ethereal. When she reached the microphone, she didn't touch it at first. She looked at her guests, the people who had shaped her life, filled her childhood, supported her dreams. She looked at her parents, whose eyes softened when she met their gaze. She looked at old friends, mentors, cousins, people who had shared pieces of her world for years. And then, slowly, she looked at Jonathan. His smile was tight, strained, forced into place. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on the tablecloth. His eyes never left her. She dropped her gaze to Harper next. Harper was pale. Her lipstick looked suddenly too bright. Her chest rose and fell too quickly. Their fear wasn't loud. Fear rarely is. It was in their stillness, in what they didn't do, in how they waited. Liana finally lifted the microphone. The speakers quieted the music, dimmed the murmurs, and welcomed her voice into the room with tender expectancy. She inhaled softly, and when she exhaled, it wasn't doubt leaving her body. It was every fragment of illusion she had carried until this night. She spoke with a calm that did not belong to a bride. It belonged to a woman finally telling her truth. "I didn't expect to speak again tonight," she began, her voice smooth, steady. "I thought I had already said everything important." Soft smiles formed around the room. She held them gently in her words. "But sometimes," she continued, "the truth doesn't reveal itself until after the vows." Jonathan shifted. Harper flinched. Guests leaned in, listening. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you walk into a moment thinking you understand what love looks like, how loyalty sounds, what a lifetime should feel like." A ripple of emotion swept through the room, people nodding, believing she was reflecting on marriage more deeply. Her eyes moved slowly, from table to table. And then, she whispered, "You hear something that changes everything." Jonathan's jaw clenched. Harper's hands gripped the tablecloth. The room fell silent, not politely, not passively, silently in the way people become when they sense something delicate, dangerous, shifting beneath the surface. Liana breathed in again. "And after that, you can never look at the world the same way." She wasn't crying. Her voice didn't shake. This wasn't a confession steeped in pain. It was a reclamation. A soft, lethal truth wrapped in ethereal calm. Her mother's eyes widened slightly. Her father's hand tensed on his glass. Whispers began in the back, low, confused, uncertain. Jonathan stood up from his chair suddenly, interrupting the stillness. He took one step forward. "Liana," he began quietly. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her calm, her posture, her silence toward him, it froze him more effectively than any scream could. He lowered himself back into his chair, fear flickering across his face for the first time that night. Harper pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. The room waited, breathless, suspended, tethered to the next words the bride might say. Not because they expected drama, but because they sensed truth approaching like a wave. A truth she now held in her hands like a living thing, and she was about to give it a voice. For a long, stretching moment, the entire room held its breath. Not because anyone understood what was coming, but because instinct whispered that something important, something irreversible, had arrived at the edges of their celebration. Liana stood alone beneath the chandelier's soft glow, the microphone resting in her hand like a truth she had carried all her life. Her gown shimmered faintly, her veil catching light like it was woven from calm itself. Her posture was steady, grounded, the type of posture a woman only finds when she finally recognizes her own worth. Tonight, she said softly, I want to speak honestly, not as a bride, but as a woman. Guests leaned back in their seats, some nodded, some tilted their heads, some exchanged glances, unsure of what she meant, but captivated all the same. Jonathan sat frozen, eyes locked on her, breathing shallow. His fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. Harper's face had drained of all color, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves, her hands trembling against her lap. Liana's voice carried not pain, but clarity. Before the ceremony, I overheard something. A soft collective inhale rippled through the room. A few guests whispered, confused. Her mother covered her mouth, sensing something shifting beneath her daughter's calm. Liana didn't look at Jonathan, didn't look at Harper. She kept her eyes on her guests, the people who deserved to understand the truth, because they had loved her long before today. I heard two people speaking who thought I wasn't close enough to listen. They said things that weren't meant for me, but were meant to shape my future. A murmur moved through the crowd. Someone gasped quietly. A bridesmaid clutched the edge of her chair. A distant uncle leaned forward, brows furrowed. Jonathan's face strained into a hollow imitation of a smile. Liana, maybe. She lifted one hand gently, not to silence him with force but with composure. And that one gesture, soft, graceful, shut him down more completely than anger ever could. He sank back into his seat. She continued. I heard plans that didn't include love. Plans that didn't include loyalty. Plans that treated marriage as a strategy, and me as an asset. Her father's jaw tightened, eyes hardening with protective fury. Someone whispered, oh my God. Another said, who would? A cousin stood slightly, then sat back down, stunned. Jonathan's breathing grew louder, a man drowning in a silence he could no longer control. Harper pressed both hands to her face as if trying to disappear into her palms. Liana finally looked at them, not with anger, not with sadness, with recognition. Because recognition is the deepest form of truth. She turned her phone slowly in her hand. The same device that had played the message for her in the greenhouse. The same device that held their whispered plan like a captured ghost. I don't believe in revenge, she said quietly. It's a cycle. And I think cycles break only when someone chooses truth instead of pain. Her voice deepened into something beautifully steady. So tonight, I choose truth. She lifted her phone and tapped the screen. A soft click escaped the speakers. An audio file began to play. Jonathan's voice filled the tent. Make sure she stays calm. Today can't fall apart. A gasp tore through the room. Then Harper's voice, shaking but intimate. You promise this won't get messy? The bridesmaids covered their mouths in horror. And then Jonathan's final line, the one that hollowed the air entirely. She signs, we smile, papers go through, and after that, we do what we talked about. Silence. Thick, crushing silence. The entire tent froze in place. Someone dropped a fork. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered a curse. A few chairs scraped back. People rose, unable to remain seated. Mothers pulled daughters closer. Fathers straightened like soldiers preparing for battle. The entire room had become a single heartbeat, throbbing with disbelief. Harper broke first. She let out a strangled sob, collapsing back into her chair. The locket she always clutched hit her collarbone with a sharp, metallic sound. She shook her head, hair falling across her face, whispering frantic excuses that no one heard because no one cared. Jonathan stood abruptly, knocked over his glass. Wine spilled across the table like a stain blooming. Liana, stop, he pleaded. Don't do this. We can talk. She shook her head gently. There's nothing left to talk about, she said. Not when truth has already spoken. Her calm, her devastating calm, silenced him more deeply than the recording ever could. He took a step toward her. Her father rose. 3 uncles stood as well. Jonathan froze mid-step, swallowing hard as he realized the room had turned against him with brutal, unified clarity. No allies, no shadows to hide in, no woman to manipulate. He was exposed, laid bare, small. Liana lifted the microphone again, speaking not to Jonathan, but to the room. "You came here to celebrate love," she said. "I won't let this moment turn into a spectacle. Not of sorrow and not of anger." She looked around at her guests, at the people who mattered. "So instead of ending this night with a lie, I'm ending it with gratitude." Her voice softened, warm, real. "Thank you for being here, for loving me, for believing in the woman I've become, not the woman someone else tried to shape me into." A few guests began to cry softly. "So tonight," she continued, "I reclaim my life, my choices, my future." Then she exhaled, a soft, sacred release. "And I return the man who never deserved me to the shadows he came from." Gasps. Applause. A wave of emotion rising so intensely it nearly lifted the tent itself. She stepped back from the microphone, letting the truth settle over the room like a final, undeniable verdict. Jonathan reached out one last time. "Liana." She looked at him, and the look alone ended everything. She turned away, calm, graceful, sovereign, and walked toward her parents, her veil flowing behind her like a banner of rebirth. The crowd parted for her instinctively. People whispered her name like a vow. Someone reached out and touched her hand in support. Another whispered, "You're stronger than you know." Jonathan stood frozen, trapped beneath the weight of his own ambition. Harper sobbed silently, the locket slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a hollow sound. And Liana? She didn't look back. Not once. Because some women don't leave the past. They ascend from it. In the quiet after the storm, long after the tent had emptied and whispers had drifted into the night, Liana stood beneath the old oak tree outside the estate, the same tree that had watched her grow from girl to bride to something far stronger. The lanterns flickered in the branches above her, and for the first time all night, she allowed herself to breathe in fully. She had walked into the evening believing she was gaining a husband. She walked out discovering she had gained herself. And sometimes, that is the greatest love story of all. She lifted her face to the night sky, soft, steady, free. The truth hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her, and the silence that followed wasn't an ending. It was a beginning.